Imagine waking up as one of the most powerful generals in the world, looking out across a calm harbor and seeing something that should not exist. That is exactly what happened to British General William Howe on the morning of June 17th, 1775. Overnight, out of nowhere, an entire fortress had appeared on the hills across from his fleet. Cannons, walls, trenches, all built in complete silence, while his ships sat anchored less than a mile away. He had 2,000 of the best trained soldiers on Earth. The men on that hill were farmers and blacksmiths carrying hunting rifles. By every rule of war, this fight was already decided. What nobody knew yet was that by sunset, that hillside would become one of the bloodiest afternoons in British military history.
To understand how this moment happened, you have to picture Boston in the spring of 1775. The city was under siege, but not in the way you would expect. British soldiers controlled the streets. Warships controlled the harbor. Checkpoints sat on every corner, and armed patrols marched along the waterfront like the city belonged entirely to them. But step outside those city limits, and the entire picture flipped. Thousands of colonial militiamen had poured in from across New England, setting up camps in every direction. Farm boys who dropped their tools, old men who dug out muskets from wars decades earlier, all surrounding the most powerful army on the planet and trapping it inside its own stronghold.
It was a strange kind of standoff. The British owned the city, but they could not leave it. Every patrol that tried to push past the outskirts got picked off by colonial snipers hiding behind stone walls and fences. So British command decided to break the deadlock. Reinforcements arrived by ship, bringing 3 of Britain's most experienced generals with fresh troops and a clear plan. Take the high ground surrounding Boston, place cannons on it, and force the colonial militias to scatter under fire. On paper, it was a brilliant strategy. Whoever controlled the hills controlled the entire siege, and the British intended to be the ones standing on top of them.
But word got out. Intelligence in 1775 traveled fast in both directions, and colonial leaders soon learned exactly what the British were planning. So on the night of June 16th, roughly 1,200 militiamen marched out of Cambridge under total darkness, with orders to fortify Bunker Hill, the tallest point on the peninsula. But when they arrived, their commander made a decision that would completely reshape what happened next. Instead of digging in on Bunker Hill, they moved to a smaller hill just ahead of it, called Breed's Hill, close enough to put them directly within range of the British warships. It seemed like a small adjustment. It was anything but small.
All through that night, 1,200 exhausted men dug with everything they had. No lanterns, no fires. Orders passed only in whispers, so the sentries on the anchored ships would not hear a sound. They built walls 6 feet high, packed the dirt down by hand, and worked in near total silence under a warm June sky. At one point, a shovel scraped against a rock, and every single man froze, staring out at the dark shapes of the warships floating just offshore. Nothing happened. And somehow, almost unbelievably, the entire British fleet missed what 1,200 men were building right under their noses through the whole night. At first light, a sailor aboard a British warship finally spotted the new fortress rising out of the morning fog. Within minutes, cannon fire lit up the harbor. The bombardment looked terrifying from a distance,
smoke and dirt exploding across the hilltop. But the angle was wrong. Most of the shots sailed over the walls or buried harmlessly into the packed earth. Back in Boston, the generals argued over what to do next. One wanted to outflank the colonists and cut off their escape entirely, a smart and nearly bloodless plan. But General Howe wanted something different. He wanted a direct frontal charge, believing that crushing the rebels head-on would break the spirit of the entire uprising once and for all. Around 1 in the afternoon, British soldiers began crossing the harbor by the boatload, each man carrying roughly 60 pounds of gear on his back. They formed into disciplined lines on the beach, red coats blazing against the green grass, and began marching straight up the hill under the brutal June sun. On top of that hill, the colonial commander watched him come, knowing his men were outgunned, undertrained, and dangerously low on ammunition. Some had only 15 rounds each. Others had packed their guns with scraps of metal and broken glass just to have something to fire. So he gave them one simple order that would echo through history for the next 250 years. Hold your fire until you can see the whites of their eyes. The distance closed. 300 yards, then 200, then barely 100, with British officers walking proudly out front in their gold-trimmed uniforms. Then the entire colonial line erupted at once. The effect was instant and devastating. Officers dropped first, exactly as instructed, and entire rows of soldiers collapsed behind them as musket balls tore through their tightly packed formation. The advance shattered into chaos within seconds. Soldiers stumbled over fallen comrades and slipped in the blood-soaked grass, unable to push forward through the wall of gunfire. Within minutes, the first wave retreated down the hill, leaving the slope scattered with the dead and wounded behind them. Most armies would have stopped there, but these were trained regulars, built from day one to follow orders no matter the cost. So Howe reformed his lines and sent them back up a second time. This attempt went even worse. The colonists let them close in again before unleashing another brutal volley. And on the flank, one commander told his men not to fire a single shot until the enemy crossed a stake he had planted in the ground 40 yards out. When they did, his troops opened fire so intensely that survivors later said British soldiers fell in rows like wheat cut down by a scythe. By the end of this second failed assault, the British had already suffered hundreds of casualties without capturing a single inch of ground. Howe gathered reinforcements and almost unbelievably decided to try a third time. But this time, he changed everything. He ordered his men to drop their heavy packs, narrowed the attack to focus directly on the fort, and told them not to stop and fire on the way up. Just charge straight in with bayonets. This time, it worked differently. The colonists, nearly out of ammunition, fired their last rounds, then threw rocks, swung their muskets like clubs, and grabbed fence rails to use as spears. British soldiers finally poured over the walls, and what followed was brutal hand-to-hand combat in thick smoke, so dense that men could barely see who they were fighting. Inside that chaos, a respected colonial leader named Joseph Warren was killed instantly by a musket ball, a loss that one British officer later said was worth 500 ordinary soldiers to the rebel cause. With no ammunition left, the colonial commander ordered a retreat, and by late afternoon, the British held the hill. Technically, they had won. But the cost of that win was staggering. Of roughly 2,200 British soldiers who took part in the assault, over 1,000 became casualties. with more than 200 killed outright. Entire companies lost every single officer they had. In comparison, the colonists lost around 450 men total. The British had captured one small, strategically minor hill, and it had cost them nearly half their attacking force in a single afternoon. Casualty numbers that rivaled some of the bloodiest battles in European history, against an army that was supposedly just a disorganized colonial mob. One British general who had opposed the frontal assault from the start wrote that night that this had been a victory bought far too dearly, warning that one more win like it would leave them with no army left in America at all. And General Howe himself never fully recovered from what he witnessed that day. Officers who served under him later in the war said he became cautious, almost to a fault, hesitating at moments when boldness could have ended the entire rebellion. At the Battle of Long Island, he had George Washington's army completely cornered with no way out, and instead of finishing the fight, he paused to set up a formal siege. Washington quietly evacuated 9,000 soldiers across a river overnight under cover of fog, one of the greatest escapes in military history, made possible entirely because Howe would not push forward.
This is really the true legacy of that single afternoon on Breed's Hill. The British technically won the ground, but they lost something far more important: the belief that professional soldiers would always crush untrained colonial fighters without a real fight. After that day, they knew they were facing men who would hold their fire, aim for the officers, and keep fighting even after their ammunition ran dry. And when news of the battle spread through the other colonies, it did not feel like a defeat at all. It felt like proof. Proof that this fight against the most powerful army on earth was actually winnable. And that belief alone helped carry an entire revolution forward for 8 more years.